Hi, y'all. Welcome to our Thursday lecture of Manhood and Masculinity. In case some of you didn't see my announcement, we are trying Zoom today instead of chat. So I'm going to post this video on the YouTube channel. If you would like to do synchronous participation on our Thursday, March 26th class, what you're going to want to do is watch this either in advance of class or starting at 11 a.m. And then you're going to proceed to our Zoom meeting at 11:40. Okay, this video is about 40 minutes long. So whenever you finish it, 11:40 a.m., we'll all be convening in Zoom. The meeting link was in the announcement, but it's also posted if you go to what's now labeled Zoom and Chat. Under our content section, you will be able to click the 326 link and it should take you to the Zoom room. So it is okay if you want to do this asynchronously instead. You can continue to post on discussion boards if you can't make it to class. In Zoom, there's also a chat feature that you can use to type comments if you're not comfortable talking. But most of you voted to try Zoom, so we're going to go ahead and do that. The other quick announcement I have is I moved back the deadline of your assignment. It is now due on Tuesday instead of today. And finally, I have also created a new discussion forum on our website that's just for social things. So if you go to discussions and scroll down, you'll see that there's now a second forum besides just reading responses, and you can post whatever you want there. If you just want to touch base with your classmates, if you're looking for somebody to help you on an essay project and partner with you out on that, or bounce some ideas around, you can go there. If you want to post pictures of your pets, go for it. I'll be checking it occasionally. I really like getting updates on what y'all are up to. And I know we're all a little starved for interaction. So you can do that. For the remainder of the lecture today, I'm going to shift gears a little bit from what we were talking about last week with sports and scouting and talk to you a little bit about the history of American imperialism. For the second part of this lecture, I want to just pivot a little bit and talk to you about what you read for today, which is the relationship between masculinity and U.S. imperialism. Now, when we think about imperialism, we know from our previous readings that that's not something that's unique to the turn of the 20th century. We have talked, for instance, about the Mexican-American War and the United States' desire to take over Mexican territory. We've also talked about filibustering, which were, again, these private expeditions that went out and attempted to conquer foreign territories, be they Nicaragua or Cuba, for the United States. And so imperialism is something that's kind of long-standing. And yet, the late 19th and the early 20th centuries will be, in many ways, a peak period for U.S. imperialism and U.S. imperial ambitions. There's a kind of fervor for gaining new territory during this period, and politicians and citizens alike actually started calling for the United States to annex or seize political control of various other nations and territories, including, among others, Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Now, part of the reason, and that's not an exhaustive list, by the way. Now, part of the reason that many Americans wanted to seize control of these areas, as you read today, was undoubtedly economic, right? These are tropical territories in many cases that are capable of growing fruit and sugar for United States markets, and those are quite profitable crops. But what I want to point out to you in this lecture is that the desire to seize these foreign lands for economic gain is also intimately related to the anxieties that people have about masculinity during this period in U.S. history. And in order to understand why that is and how those anxieties translated to a kind of imperialistic fervor during this period, we have to understand something about the history of the concept of the frontier in American life. Okay, so let's take a step back a minute and go to 1890. Okay, So, one of the very significant things that happened in 1890 is that the United States conducted a census. And if you've ever done any kind of historical research, you know that this census is not really available to historians because it actually burned in a fire. And so, if you ever want to research where your ancestors were in 1890, good luck, at least using the census. But the census did reveal something very important that year, which is it revealed that there essentially was no more territory that could be classed as frontier in the United States. Okay, so I want to point out at the start, right, the term frontier is in and of itself a little problematic because Western territories, as we well know, were occupied by indigenous peoples in many cases before Anglo-Americans pushed over, or white Americans pushed over to the West. But there was this sense among a lot of Americans of mourning after the 1890 census because there essentially was no more quote-unquote wilderness or frontier left to conquer after this. And this loss of the frontier created a kind of national feeling of sadness, and one that highlighted the already substantial fears that people had that masculinity was on the verge of collapse or was threatened in some way. And if we want to understand why that is the case, what is the connection between the closing of this frontier and anxieties about masculinity, I think we have to understand something about the significance of the frontier to American culture and to American men. We've read in this class before that men who weren't doing particularly well in East Coast cities often moved west to try to find opportunities for land ownership, right? And not just opportunities for land ownership or economic prosperity, but also opportunities to escape the kind of civilizing influences of the East Coast. There was this real sense that the West is a safety valve where men can go to be men and tough it out and experience what life is like outside of the safe little bubble of civilization. And I'm sure that when I'm saying this, probably you're mentally connecting this to some of the themes we've been talking about when it comes to this emphasis on primitivism, the emphasis on passionate masculinity, the emphasis on reverting back to an earlier state of human development that people thought was so important to developing a healthy kind of masculinity. But even beyond that, the frontier had a kind of unique political and social significance in American life. It was really central to the way that Americans in the late 19th century thought of their own culture and thought of their own history and national development. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of a historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, but he was among the kind of first generation of professional historians, and he gave a very famous address on the frontier in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair, which was this massive event designed to sort of celebrate progress and display various cultures, etc. And so Turner is giving this speech on the frontier 3 years after the Census Bureau has declared the frontier closed. And what he said about this, what his comments were on the closing of the frontier was he said, look, we're essentially entering a new epoch in American life because the frontier has until this point been the center of American cultural creation. It is the place where American culture has been created and continually recapitulated over time. It is where, according to Turner, Americans developed their unique Americanness and developed also the qualities, and I'm quoting here, quote, that coarseness and strength combined with acuteness and acquisitiveness, that practical, inventive turn of mind, quick to find expedients, that masterful grasp of material things, that restless, nervous energy, that dominant individualism. For Turner, all of those qualities, and they're qualities that we kind of associate with American exceptionalism, with the self-made man, with kind of the go-getter capitalist spirit of America, all of those qualities, Turner says, are qualities that actually develop in the wilderness. And for Turner, these are qualities that come from having to conquer nature, right? Having to face a kind of vast emptiness and will yourself to carve something from it, right? To tough it out, to make a living for yourself, and in doing so, to become somebody who has been inculcated into the values of individualism, of go-getter spirit, etc. And I think about this in terms of what G. Stanley Hall had to say about recapitulation, because G. Stanley Hall had this idea that for a man to become civilized, he had to relive the whole history of human development as he grew up, right? Well, Frederick Jackson Turner kind of thought that each new generation of Americans had to repeat this process of conquering the frontier so that they could grow up, so that they could figure out how to be good individualists, good democratic citizens, etc. And for Turner, it was the frontier that gave Americans their exceptionalism, right? And so this raises kind of obvious questions about what happens when the frontier closes. And if we want to see these questions kind of in action, and if we want to see an exemplar of someone who, like Turner, believed that the frontier was absolutely crucial to the creation of the American spirit, we have to look at a figure that some of you have mentioned in this class previously, which is this guy, Teddy Roosevelt. Now, when I ask my students oftentimes what they sort of think about Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of them point to him as a kind of icon of masculinity, right? He's a man's man. And similarly, when we look at the way historians have talked about Roosevelt, he's kind of the quintessential figure in the history of turn-of-the-century masculinity, right? If Andrew Jackson is the figure we think about when we think about the rise of American democracy, or Abraham Lincoln is the figure who we think about when we think about the Civil War and the reconciling of political divisions, Teddy Roosevelt is kind of the guy we think about when we conceive of some of the changes that were happening in American masculinity at this point. But this is really interesting to think about, because this kind of image of Roosevelt, and I love this picture of him, right? Man spreading, crossing his arms. He looks very kind of tough. His jaw is accentuated by his sort of mutton chop haircut here. We think about Roosevelt as this kind of man's man tough guy, but the kind of ironic thing about him is that when he was younger, he actually encapsulated most of the anxieties that people had about the kind of weakness of American masculinity. So I don't know if any of you have watched the Ken Burns documentary about the Roosevelts. It's kind of good. I watched some of it recently. But if you've watched that, or if you know anything about Roosevelt, you know he's born in New York to a very wealthy family. And then he had a rather aristocratic and pampered upbringing. As a child, he'd actually been fairly sickly, fairly small, and he was certainly not someone who kind of fit the masculine ideal. In fact, people were kind of worried that his various lung ailments, etc., meant he might not survive very long. And yet, as a boy, Roosevelt was really fascinated by the idea of manly adventure, and particularly manly adventure in the American West, which was very different than the world he inhabited, right? He's in New York City. He doesn't get more civilized than that in the United States, and I'm using civilized in a kind of scare quotey way here. But the idea is he's living in the largest city in the United States, and yet, as a boy, he would constantly fantasize about being able to go on adventures that as a sickly child he really didn't have much hope of going on. He would constantly read novels and serialized stories about men journeying into the West, fighting Indians and wild animals, studying nature, charting new territory, and killing all the buffalo. So he's kind of he really likes these kind of naturalist adventurer stories that are not unlike Tarzan fantasies in a way, right? Going into the wilderness. And Teddy Roosevelt actually recalled as a child he was so obsessed with this kind of idea of the natural world and what it could do for him that he actually went to the public market and he saw a dead seal and he got obsessed with it because to him it was like having all the adventures of his childhood, you know, conquering the Arctic and whatnot, brought to life in front of him. and he ended up actually buying the seal's skull, which he measured very carefully and documented the dimensions of, and then put in his room as a kind of imitation of the naturalists whose undertaking so fascinated him. Initially, though, Roosevelt, of course, was not going on these adventures, as I said, because he's very, very physically weak. And it was not really until he reached his teen years that he started managing to overcome that. He would kind of constantly try to exercise. He would constantly try to scuffle with his brothers and other people who were around and sort of establish his manliness that way. And when he got to college, he sort of fashioned himself this way. He liked to play sports. He liked to be a kind of man's man. But actually, and this is kind of funny to us now, but even as he was sort of early on in his career, Teddy Roosevelt had a really hard time shaking the image of himself as a kind of effete aristocrat. And one of the kind of funny things is Roosevelt constantly got called a dude early on his political career. Now, when we think of a dude, I think we use that oftentimes as like a generic term for a bro nowadays. Like, hey dude, what's up? If you're from California, you use it to refer to everything, right? Sinks, inanimate objects, everything is dude. But in the 19th century, dude had kind of specific meanings. And the term actually comes from Yankee Doodle, which is appropriate because, as you may remember from some of our previous class discussions, Yankee Doodle has a line about somebody who mimics the macaroni dress style, right? And macaronis are dandies. They're people who are kind of very fashionable, maybe even slightly effeminate in their fashion choices. And so when you called somebody a dude, you were calling them essentially a dandy or a fop. And a dude in the late 19th century, the kind of stereotypical image would be this one. Someone who was snappily dressed in tight pants, who was overly concerned with keeping up with fashion, who had a kind of aristocratic, maybe even English-inspired flair, and who was actually a bit sexually ambiguous, both in terms of his own gender performance and his sexual desires. So a kind of classic dude figure in the late 19th century was actually Oscar Wilde, who, if you don't know anything about Oscar Wilde, was probably the most famous quote-unquote homosexual in the world in the late 19th century. And so if Oscar Wilde is considered a dude, so is Teddy Roosevelt, which is a kind of comparison with some resonances that nobody really misses at the time. If we now think of Roosevelt as being the sort of ultimate man's man, in the 19th century, late 19th century, early in his career, he's actually portrayed as kind of a sissy, and people actually imply that he may be, well, homosexual, and I don't think that you can kind of miss the implication here if you look at this picture. People actually accused Roosevelt at various points of being, quote, given to sucking the knob of an ivory cane. And I don't think I have to flesh out for you what the sort of implications there are, but it's this kind of critique of wealth and sexuality that somebody who's extremely wealthy, who's aristocratic, is going to automatically be kind of effeminate. And so Roosevelt was very much not thought of as somebody who was kind of a tough, rugged, manly man early on. So how does he get to be that? Well, Roosevelt kind of self-consciously remakes himself. And one of the ways that he does that is actually by venturing into the American West, right? He's one of these guys that's very much playing out part of the process that Turner is talking about, right? So after his wife Alice's untimely death in 1884, Roosevelt actually had a cabin constructed in Medford, North Dakota, and he made a very big deal about relocating there from New York. We've talked in this class before about men sort of conceiving of a move to the West as being part of the thrill of conquering virgin territory and experiencing the hardships of life in nature, well, that was very much Roosevelt. And when he moved west, he very much adopted the airs and practices of a Western pioneer. And he even said at one point, lest you think that he wasn't kind of self-consciously trying to remake himself, he said at one point, quote, "It would electrify some of my friends who have accused me of representing the kid glove element in politics if they could see me galloping over the plains day in and day out, clad in a buckskin shirt and leather chaparajos and with a big sombrero on my head. For good, healthy exercise, I would strongly recommend some of our gilded youth go west and try a short course of riding bucking ponies and assist the branding of a lot of Texas steers." So, kind of classic thing. Go west, young men. Leave your pampered lives behind and toughen up. And Roosevelt actually wrote a series of books about living as an outdoorsman and Western adventurer that became quite popular and that were very much in line with the broader theme of American men resisting the over-civilization of urban life. But for Roosevelt, the West wasn't necessarily just a place where individual men could go to boost their masculinity by doing tough stuff. It was also, and here's where he's again echoing Turner, a place where the white race as a whole remade itself and established its superiority by engaging in a sort of constant combat with Native Americans. So Roosevelt actually saw in some of his more objectionable moments, fighting savagery and clashing with members of other races as very important to the creation of American identity. By battling Native Americans, Roosevelt thought that white men participated in a fierce struggle that ultimately strengthened their race, proved their superiority, and brought the light of civilization to the wilderness. And he actually said this pretty explicitly at one point. Quote, he wrote, "The most ultimately righteous of all wars is a war with savages, though it is apt also to be most terrible and inhumane. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the lands lays all civilized mankind under a debt to him." So again, we have this vision of conquering not just the wilderness, but conquering other people, more specifically, quote-unquote, red or brown people, as being a really central part of the project of creating an American identity and spreading democratic culture, which Roosevelt thought was very important. So this raises a very obvious question, though, which is, if the frontier is the place where American men can make themselves, and if it's where American identity is born, what is going to happen when there's no more West to conquer? What's to become of the American political system? What's to become of American masculinity when there's no more escape valve built in? Well, I'm sure you could see from our readings where this is going. The answer is the United States is going to turn to imperialism quite a bit. And Roosevelt himself is actually kind of an arch-imperialist. So he followed his comment about the need for the white race to establish civilization in the West by saying, quote, "It is of incalculable importance that America, Australia, and Siberia should pass out of the hands of their red, black, and yellow Aboriginal owners and become the heritage of the dominant world races." So you can see here how the idea of taking the American continent, of civilizing the West, can easily transfer itself to new frontiers outside of America. Now it is the duty of white people to claim land from all quote-unquote inferior races around the world. And I'm making scare quotes with my fingers here. Please do not hear me endorsing this idea. But this becomes a kind of big American project, right? Americans take up an imperial project quite eagerly during this period, and there is a lot of support for American intervention in various foreign countries. So America occupies Haiti in the early 20th century. And the American military helped to create conditions under which a lot of international corporations could thrive in Latin America and the Caribbean, and this includes, of course, United Fruit. And most notably, the United States actually went to war with Spain and succeeded in acquiring many of its territories, including Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. And that war was called the Spanish-American War, and it was fought in 1898. So one question you might have, what is the Spanish-American War actually about? Well, it started out as a conflict that it was at least somewhat about Spanish control of Cuba. So Spain had owned Cuba as a colonial possession in the 19th century, but Cuba was very unstable, to say the least, during this period. By the mid-1890s, Cubans had been waging struggles for their independence from Spain on and off for decades. And in the 1890s, many Americans started to call for U.S. intervention in support of Cuban independence. And there were several reasons that this movement caught on. For one thing, and this is kind of the most benign reason, a lot of Americans had real sympathy with Cubans. Some drew parallels with Cubans' experiences and the experiences of their own revolutionary generation, right? So just as the American colonies had been yoked under British tyranny and had kind of heroically thrown that off, so too were Cubans yoked by the Spanish, right? By their relationship with Spain. And in a rare departure from their tendency to treat anyone who wasn't sort of Anglo-white as being unmanly, Americans actually praised Cuban revolutionaries as being dignified and brave freedom fighters who were lashing out against a cruel and feminized and tyrannical Spain. Okay, so here they're portraying the Spanish as being very feminized and sort of effete aristocrats, whereas the Cubans are manly revolutionaries in the vein of American patriots. Now, public opinion swung even harder towards the Cuban side of the conflict when Spain decided to put down the Cuban rebellion with force instead of negotiating. Okay. So Americans start to become very sympathetic. They see in Cubans' experiences something of their own experiences with Britain early on in the Revolutionary era. Another factor that motivated U.S. intervention in Cuba was, as the article you read today suggests, that United States corporations had a very large financial stake in Cuba, a much larger one than the Spanish had at that point, in fact. Americans had brought up sugar plantations in Cuba after the Civil War, as well as land on which to grow fruit. So stepping in to end the turmoil in Cuba was a matter of sort of U.S. economic interest, because there were a lot of American corporations that owned land there. So stabilizing the economy became a way of kind of defending the market, so to speak. Actually, despite kind of these obvious motivations for the United States to declare war on Cuba, there was a kind of hesitance at first for U.S. authorities, including President William McKinley, to act on Cubans' behalf. McKinley was very hesitant to go to war with Spain initially. It actually took two different incidents to pressure him into intervening. And one of those was a leaked telegram. The first of those was a leaked telegram. So in December of 1897, Spanish ambassador to the U.S., Enrique I'm not going to butcher this pronunciation, Dupuy de Lome, telegraphed a friend that McKinley was, quote, weak and catering to the rabble and besides a low politician. Now, if we think about, say, our Sumner reading and what we've learned about the language of masculinity and honor and insult, you can see how this would really piss McKinley off, right? They're using adjectives to describe him that would be very contrary to how most men would see themselves. Weak is a feminized adjective, right? Catering to the rabble and besides a low politician. So in other words, they're saying you're not a man of dignity. You are kind of demagogue, right? You're somebody who is sort of brash and tacky and you're not fit to be a leader. And Americans really dwelled on this insult to McKinley's masculine honor and insisted that actually, by saying that the leader of the United States was not a strong man, Spain had insulted the entirety of the United States. That Spain had essentially said to American men, you have a weak leader, and therefore you are weak, right? Your country is a country of weak and kind of feckless men. The second incident involved an explosion of the USS Maine in the Havana harbor. Now, it's not actually clear what caused the ship to explode, but many Americans blamed the Spanish for this and said this is essentially an act of aggression. The United States has to declare war. When McKinley urged calm pending the completion of an investigation, jingoists and warhawks who really wanted a conflict with Spain actually castigated him in part by questioning his manhood. They demanded, quote, a declaration of American virility or any sign of manhood from the White House. Right? So in other words, just like with the Mexican-American War, where people had kind of said, if you're not willing to fight, then you're a wuss, whereas strong men want to go in and, clean up the territory and rescue Mexican women from their lazy and effeminate husbands. They're essentially saying the same thing to McKinley. If you don't act, if you want to wait for science to come into this, then you're not a real man, right? A real man just goes into battle. And so they also demanded that McKinley have a quote-unquote backbone, right? You need backbone, which is very gendered language. And so McKinley actually did intervene. The United States declared war on Spain, and they fought this war not just in Cuba, but also in Manila and in the Philippines, which the U.S. would take control of after their victory, and in Puerto Rico, which they would often also take from the Spanish, which is why Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory now. Although, as recent events revealed, not all Americans realize that. So the justification for taking the Philippines was that Filipino people need to be freed from the Spanish, and also because they were, by and large, brown people, governed by a superior race because they were feminized and incapable of governing themselves. This was the U.S. logic of imperialism and colonialism here. Now, when the Spanish-American War broke out, Teddy Roosevelt was actually Assistant Secretary of the Navy and one of the people who had been very stridently calling for war, and he took a very bizarre step, albeit one that was really in keeping with his character. He resigned his post and enlisted in the military. Roosevelt maintained that fighting was his responsibility, and he had indeed advocated for many years for what he called the strenuous life, right? Men need to live strenuous lives. And so he said now that there was a military conflict, it was his duty to risk everything to defend his position. So Roosevelt was actually commissioned at the rank of lieutenant colonel, and he quickly set about raising his own regiment, which many, many men flocked to join. And this is that group here. They were known as Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Do not Google that. The pictures are awkward. And they were a very odd mix of people on the face of it. On one hand, Roosevelt liked recruiting cowboys, right? He loved ranch hands, Indian fighters, people who reminded him of kind of traditional Western heroes. And on the other hand, he recruited a lot of college men from Ivy League schools like the one he had gone to, especially Harvard and Yale. And if we think about why he did this, it is clear that he wants that kind of balance that we've been talking about for the last week between primitivism and sort of rough masculinity and civilized and developed masculinity, right? Restrained masculinity. So for Roosevelt, these two groups each represented a kind of strength of white manhood at that time. Civilization and brute strength were dual pillars of a kind of superior white American culture. And fighting the Spanish-American War was simultaneously an adventure for Roosevelt and his men, and an opportunity to be part of a broader effort to help fulfill white Americans' racial destiny through the spread of civilization, or at least this was the idea at the time. And of course, the conflict was successful. The U.S. defeated Spain in just a few months and took most of its colonial possessions. And it also, by the way, annexed Hawaii during this war because the U.S. needed a Pacific fueling station to help its war efforts. Roosevelt, whose exploits during the war were very heavily covered by the press, actually returned a national hero and perhaps the most famous man in America at the time, and he was never again after this called a dude. So as Roosevelt ascended national political ranks, he actually became a big advocate for some things that are very familiar to us now, including national parks. And when we think about national parks, which have been a topic of conversation a lot lately, what with the coronavirus, one of the things we think about is, well, conservation, right? Environmentalism. But there's also that desire to preserve wilderness, right? Similar to building a baseball field in an urban environment as a way of bringing nature and the wilderness into a civilized world. Keeping national parks open was a way to kind of preserve some of the West as wild so that people who were used to East Coast civilized life could still go and experience nature and sort of reinvigorate themselves and shed some of the burdens that civilization placed on them. And Roosevelt, throughout his life, continued to advocate for U.S. imperialism using this language of manhood. He wrote, among other things, the timid man, the lazy man, the man who distrusts his country, the over-civilized man who has lost the great fighting, masterful virtues, the ignorant man, and the man of dull mind, whose soul is incapable of feeling the mighty lift that thrills. Stern men with empires in their brains. All of these, of course, shrink from seeing the nation undertake its new duties, shrink from seeing us build a navy and an army adequate to our needs, shrink from seeing us do our share of the world's work by bringing order out of chaos in the great fair tropic islands from which the valor of our soldiers and sailors has driven the Spanish flag. These are the men who fear the strenuous life, who fear the only national life which is really worth leading. They believe in that cloistered life which saps the hardy virtues in a nation as it saps them in the individual. So in other words, if you don't want a massive expansion of the U.S. military, if you don't want to see the U.S. Take over foreign lands and start to play a greater role in global politics, you must be one of these guys that's suffering from neurasthenia, right? You must be a weak man who prefers the cloistered life to a life of adventure. And similarly, if you are supportive of U.S. imperialism, you're a real man, right? You are a guy that seeks out the frontier, that seeks out the wilderness, and is somebody who wants to participate in that project of self-making. And indeed, in the period we're talking about, the relationship between manhood and imperialism would be so strong that even opponents and critics of U.S. imperialism actually found themselves using the language of masculinity and manhood to argue against it. They turned the justification for imperialism on its head, actually, by arguing that the tropical climates actually made men degenerate, and that men's exposure and exploitation of native women would destroy the race, and that imperialism actually encouraged dangerous levels of masculine excess. So in other words, they said, no, actually, it's not that we're unconcerned with manhood, but we realize that tropical climates produce degenerate people. And we also realize that if white Anglo-Saxon men have contact with indigenous women in these places or with Spanish women in these places, they too are going to degenerate through that sexual and social contact. And so really, if the U.S. wants to preserve American manhood, it needs to not participate in these dangerous imperial projects that will inevitably dilute the vitality of the white race and of white masculinity. So you have masculinity, when we think back to our questions early in the class about how the rhetoric of manhood and masculinity can help us to understand some of the major events in American history. One thing we can see immediately is that we have to understand the kind of U.S. imperial project that was happening in the early 20th century and late 19th century as being an extension of a desire to reclaim American manhood, to give United States men a grounds on which they can prove their sort of strength, their toughness, their go-getter spirit. And so the desire to revitalize American manhood is going to lead the U.S., among many other reasons, to sort of undertake a massive imperial project. Now, I say among other reasons because, as I've told you, it's also commercial. So I want to transition at this point to our Zoom meeting where we can talk a little bit about the article you read today and about how the United Fruit Company portrayed sort of gender and conquest in this particular period that the article you read discussed. So go to Zoom now. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.